Okay, everybody. My name's Mark Malcomson. I have the honour and the privilege of being the principal at CityLit, and I am delighted to welcome everybody to our first online Perspectives lecture. The Perspectives lectures are a series that we started last year during CityLit's centenary. The first one was Professor Ian Morris of Stanford University, talking about the 8,000 years of the relationship between Britain and Europe. The second one was Grayson Perry, who discussed Divided Britain. And today we're delighted to have Sir Vince Cable, who's going to be talking to us about the economy and the pandemic. The reason we do these lectures are partly for our outreach, but also as a way of discussing and being part of the debate of things that are going on, whether it be Europe, whether it be Britain, whether it now be the virus. We're looking at issues and we're bringing world-class speakers to you as part of that kind of community that CityLit is. Obviously, this is the first one we've done online because of the circumstances we find ourselves in. And I am hugely thankful to my colleagues who've done an enormous amount of work preparing this. But I'm also delighted that Vince has agreed to do this and given his time and also put himself in our trust to make sure that the technology works. So hopefully this will work for everybody. Hopefully in the boxes that you see on the side, you will see my colleague Charmaine Andrews. She will be interpreting for our deaf community. A number of our colleagues and our students from the deaf community are part of this, and she will be there, so that's why she's in the corner. And just a couple of housekeeping issues. We're going to be spending the next hour together. We will be recording this, and when we record it, we hopefully will put it on our website at some point early next week. What we've done, by the way, for those of you who are familiar with various forms of Zoom, we've muted the chat function because obviously with a huge number of people, the hundreds of people who are on this, that would go a bit crazy. A number of you have already sent questions in for Vince, and I've got them in bundles at the moment. For those of you who are interested as we go along sending questions in, I can moderate and look at the Q&A sessions for when Vince and I have our conversation. I can't promise that we will be able to get everybody's questions answered, but I will try and group things into themes and bundles. And then really, as I point out to you, we are recording this and for presentation to other people who can't make this particular time. But I really wanted to kind of talk about why we're doing this. We do this as part of our public service, but we also do it in aid of our student bursary. Our student bursary is there to support students, particularly at this time of hardship, who might not be able to afford to come and do courses at CityLit. So there's no obligation, but any of you who would like to make a donation to the bursary, we will send a link out afterwards. The one bit that I don't think I need to spend a lot of time is introducing Vince Cable. I did notice that within about an hour of announcing this lecture, we were in the hundreds. Vince is well known to virtually everybody in the country. Until recently, leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. For many years, Secretary of State in the Cabinet for Business and also Skills, which is how CityLit got to know him very well as our minister. Former Chief Economist of Shell. He has a PhD, he has a knighthood, he has many, many honours. But really he's here primarily as an economist, but also really there's an overlay around his political skills and his knowledge. He has a huge background in policy, having worked in the commercial arena and also in government over many years. So this particular crisis is just not an economic crisis, it's a social crisis, it's one that government is trying to cope with. So he brings to us a huge depth of knowledge and a huge set of backgrounds that I think will throw some light onto what is obviously a very challenging period. Vince will be going through his slides, and then he and I will kind of go through a kind of Q&A session which is going to reflect quite a lot of the questions that you've put up, and then some that come out as a result of today. Anyway, I am delighted, without further ado, to hand over to Sir Vince Cable.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's good to be back to the City Lit, albeit in this rather strange new format. I want to talk about the economics of COVID. I think most people last few weeks have been worrying about the health side of it and the terrible death rate, the impact on the NHS. But in the next few months and indeed years, we're going to be worrying about the economic impact. We've had something unique in history. Everything's ever happened before. A government effectively closing down the economy deliberately, not just Britain, but all over the world. The assumption is it will bounce back, and it may or it may not. And in the meantime, a lot of damage being done. We got 6 million now registered unemployed, tens of thousands of businesses becoming bankrupt. Where does it all lead? Now, this is my route map, a little bit about history, about how the recovery could happen, the forces of depression and recovery in both directions, how business could respond to this positively and negatively, the impact on what we call globalization, whether the world is going to retreat inwards or continue as before. The state, are we going to have a much bigger government or a smaller government in future? And then onto the economics of this. Vast amount of debt is now piling up in government, companies and individuals. How do we manage it? And that leads me to the policy responses that governments can make. And let me start with a bit of history. I dug out some statistics on great economic disasters. The worst I could find, and this is very impressionistic, was the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that wiped out 2/3 of their economy. War, breakup, hyperinflation. The breakup of the Soviet Union was almost as bad. The Great Depression in the United States took out about 1/3 of their economy. It only really recovered 10 years later, thanks to Roosevelt's policies and then war and rearmament. In modern times, Greece suffered almost as badly, is still much worse off than before the financial crisis. The end of communism in Poland, one of the better managed transitions, cost them about 20% of their economy. And although we think of it as a mega disaster, the financial crisis, which I was involved in clearing up the mess, only took out about 5% of our economy. We thought it was a great drama, and we've had years of austerity, but in global terms, it was quite a minor problem compared with the others. At present, where we have suffered in the first few weeks, a collapse of about 30 to 40% of the British economy. Now that's only over a period of a few weeks. We don't know what it will be over a year, but this helps put it in perspective. Now, if we get a recovery, the best way of thinking about it is in terms of letters. Is it V, U, W, or L? V-shaped is what I think everybody hoped for originally. It bounces back once people have finished the lockdown. I don't think anybody now imagines that can happen, though there is some sign in China, in Korea and Taiwan, which are the best managed of the epidemic, and possibly Germany, that something of that kind can happen. Most of us, I think, are now expecting that the recovery will be shaped like a U. It will take time because people are frightened to go back to work, frightened to spend money. A lot of companies have been very badly disrupted. Their suppliers have disappeared. that I think is the standard prediction about what we're now facing. If we get a second wave or a third wave, then we're talking about a W. It's possible we could have an L, that terrible damage will be done and we won't recover. It will be a permanent loss of capacity, of people's skills, of the abilities of companies to produce things. The world economy could have been destroyed by protectionism, inward lookingness, and we just don't get back to normal. But those are all possible. I think myself, the U is the most likely. And I've drawn charts for the next couple of years just to illustrate what those letters mean. Green is the V, the blue is the W, yellow is the U-shaped. We get back to normal in about 2 years' time, having lost a lot of production wealth. And L tells us that in 2 years' time, we're still poorer, significantly poorer than we are now. So each of those is possible. Now, this explains in a very simple way the factors pulling us down and the factors pulling us up. On the negative side, we've already got mass unemployment, something most of us haven't experienced since the war. 10%, maybe 20% of people without work, despite the furlough scheme of the government. Large numbers of small companies being wiped out because they haven't got cash, they haven't got customers, people not spending, businesses not investing, terrible chronic uncertainty. We just don't know where this disease is going to go. And then bad mistakes being made in America, the Eurozone. Those are the things that could pull us down or are pulling us down. On the other hand, the positives, lockdown is beginning to be lifted in some countries. The government, and I think we have to be positive about this, has been very quick to rescue large numbers of firms, helping to keep jobs in place. There is a stimulus, a vast amount of spending is taking place to keep economies afloat. International coordination is a bit short supply. You may have heard of Theresa May's article in the Times this morning, lamenting the lack of coordination, but there is some between scientists, between central bankers and others. The Chinese and the East Asian countries are powering ahead. And then there's the hope, well, you may think hope. If we go back in history, the Roaring Twenties, after the terrible losses of the First World War, and then the what was then called the Spanish flu, everybody, who hadn't died, celebrated with a massive orgy of spending. They got into terrible debt, which contributed to the Great Depression. But there was a decade of big spending and optimism. I've listed here some of the companies which are in a very vulnerable position, some of them who have opportunities. Companies that don't have a cash flow, in other words, they're not bringing in any income and they don't have any reserves, are in trouble. But some of the big tech companies, for example, are sitting on vast piles of cash and they're safe. Bigger companies are in a stronger position than small ones because they can command credit from the banks, they can lobby the government, they probably have more resilience. A lot of small companies, I'm afraid, are going down at the moment. Those companies that have got e-commerce operations are viable under these circumstances, but those that rely on face-to-face relationships at work and with their customers are very vulnerable. And there's a distinction between, I think, companies that are very innovative, that have got used to working digitally, as opposed to old-fashioned companies that haven't like, as old fogies like me, haven't fully adapted to the modern electronic world. So there are opportunities, but there are potentially major casualties. And I've tried to give a few examples of bits of the economy that are very vulnerable and others where there are opportunities. The hospitality sector is in desperate straits. I mean, who's going to go to a restaurant in the next few months and weeks with all the social distancing problems? Who's going to go to conferencing? Very few. Hotels, what is their future? We know that the aviation industry is in desperate trouble. Professional sports without spectators, where is their income? High street retail, again, many shops are not going to reopen. And linked to that, the property market, going to concerts. Manufacturing might recover, but certainly at the moment, most of it's closed. Half the construction industry. The oil market, as you probably noticed, has collapsed completely because there's no demand. People are not traveling. And universities are in trouble because, of course, they're losing their overseas students. Now, some are doing well and potentially will do better. I mean, the supermarkets are making a bomb. So the tech companies, anything around computer services, linked activities, e-commerce, delivery companies, food production, farming, where they can get the labor, medical related activities, pharmaceuticals, ed tech, people doing online learning, and home entertainment, Spotify, Netflix, absolutely having a bomb at the moment. So the picture varies very considerably from one industry to another. Now, one of the big arguments is, will the world economy now retreat into little national silos, or will it stay integrated? And I've listed some of the forces for and against. I don't know where it will go. I'm inclined to believe it will stay fairly integrated, but as you can see on the left, there are factors working in the opposite direction: less tourism, less aviation. A lot of companies will want to stop being dependent on supplies from China. The Americans in particular becoming obsessed by national security considerations. Protectionism was already happening, and thanks to Trump, the World Trade Organization was being undermined. The internet is being split into a Chinese internet and a Western internet. We're getting a lot of nationalism, Cold War, and even in the European Union, we've seen a breakdown in cooperation. The Italians are very angry, they haven't been supported, and so on. On the other hand, technology is pulling the world more closely together. Things like this. I'm doing video conferences, not just with the City Lit, but with American, Australian, even Chinese universities. In that sense, the world is becoming closer. The scientists are discovering much better lines of communication. Those people who learn to study virtually are using often the same programs. Some international organizations like the IMF have been very quick and efficient in responding to the global emergency. So in some respects, we're being bound closer together. And you can judge, it's a matter of guesswork, I think, as to whether the pulls or pushes are strongest. There is another argument as to whether we're going to have a more powerful state, or whether the state will retreat. As you can see, most of my arrows are pointing to a bigger state and a stronger state. The government, not just in Britain, but everywhere, is having to bail out companies, help the unemployed, nationalize vulnerable companies like airlines, impose lockdown rules, now impinging on privacy with the tracing applications, and so on. I've got two little bubbles which may pull in the opposite direction. People may just get fed up of the government telling what to do and become much more libertarian. It may be that the government will be desperate about debt and will want to pull in a more private direction. But most of the arrows are pointing to a much stronger state in Britain than everywhere. And I think we may well be looking at the kind of economies which we had in the post-war era, 45 to 50, the gradual reduction in the state. Just bring the discussion round to the economic impact. I've drawn a little chart there borrowed from the Treasury, which shows the amount of public debt. That's not your household debt, but the debt of the government, the national debt, and how this links to the size of the economy. In the middle of the 19th century, indeed, after the Napoleonic Wars, the national debt was massive by today's standards. It was about twice as big as GDP. It then went back to those levels after the First World War, and even more after the Second World War. So the things we've been worrying about in the last decade, part of the austerity of the government was designed to prevent getting back to those levels. We've been at much lower levels. So let's put this in context. By the context of previous wars, we don't have a big national debt problem, but it will grow rapidly in the next few weeks and months because of all the things the government's doing. Now, I don't want to spend too much on this chart, and I'm sorry if it's a little overcomplicated, but I've just basically, it's a little model describing how the economy works at the moment. We've got fiscal policy, the spending and taxes. We've got monetary policy, which is QE, central bank, Bank of England buying up government bonds, and the use of bank rates. And I've tried to show how these things are interconnected in a system. We're getting more debt service for government, which potentially is a problem leading to austerity. I'll summarize my thoughts on that in a moment. On the other hand, we've got government through the central bank influencing interest rates, which, if they're kept very low, stimulate growth. And they also have an impact on the exchange rate. And if the exchange rate goes down, of course, that pushes up prices, and that in turn affects what the Bank of England does on interest rates. So I'm basically making the point, a very simple point, that a lot of the things that happen are interconnected. And then finally, and I'll leave you with this chart, the short-term issues are around rescue, and some of the questions there. How quickly do we exit from the lockdown? How does the workplace adjust to a quick return to normality? We've got millions and millions of people who've been plunged into poverty. So do we give everybody something in the hope of getting money to them quickly, which is what's happened in Japan and in the United States? Or do we operate through our universal credit system, which is more selective, but also cumbersome, and a lot of people feel very unfair? A lot of money is being given to companies, including some very big ones. So do we make it conditional, or just give money to as many companies as ask for it in the hope of keeping them alive and keeping the jobs? The furlough scheme, which is subsidizing people in work, is going to have to be phased out as people go back to work. But how do we do that gradually so as not to make unemployment worse? What do we do about the self-employed people? A lot of people in personal companies paying themselves dividends. They're not fat cats, but they're not getting any help at the moment. So those are some of the, what I would call the micro issues. And then the big picture, the big economic picture, I've summarized on the other side. We've got this enormous challenge now as to how to prevent the world and our own country descending into the kind of depression we had in the 1930s. We've got a massive amount of debt. And what tends to happen is that when companies and individuals and governments have a lot of debt, is they cut back. And then that makes economic depression much worse. My view about this is we shouldn't be worrying about the public debt. We can grow gradually out of it over the next 20, 30 years. Interest rates are very low. And then there's a question about why do we have debt at all? Why doesn't the Bank of England just print money to cover the emergency costs? And that is actually, I suspect, beginning to happen. It's not conventional. We've always had warnings in the past that if Bank of England or governments print money, it leads to terrible inflationary consequences. It happened in Germany before the war, in the Mugabe, Zimbabwe, and so on. This is the magic money tree problem. The reason why it's dangerous is that it would be perfectly sensible, in my view, to have limited printing of money in an emergency. But then, of course, people say, well, why can't the government print money for universal basic income or university tuition fees or everybody's favorite scheme, Green New Deals and so on? Then it's a permanent commitment, and then that spills over into inflation. So there's a very, very careful balancing act, which is having to go in between dealing with the emergency, but not allowing it to become an excuse for massive uncontrolled government spending that leads to inflation. And that's why there is a worry under all of this that there will be a reckoning, and that at some point we're going to have more taxes, more controls, tighter controls over public spending to prevent the debt burden getting completely out of control. So I hope that serves as a provocation to discussion. Back over to you, Mark.
Brilliant, Vince. And I think that was a wonderful sort of tour de force of the backdrop to everything that's going on. So we've had quite a lot of questions, both kind of prior and during. I think one of the questions I'd like to start off with, you took that historical perspective right from the beginning. Should we be treating this as a serious, normal economic event, as in the banking crisis of 10 years ago? Or should we be treating it something more akin to war from a policy decision? This disruption is so big, is it not response as usual?
Well, the banking crisis 10 years ago was a massive problem. I mean, we'd never had this in the UK since the middle of the 19th century. Potentially, it could have caused the kind of havoc that we're seeing now. I think people have perhaps rather complacently forgotten that we were saved from a major economic catastrophe, partly because central banks, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve in America, and the European Central Bank were absolutely decisive. They resorted to things which we hadn't seen before, things like quantitative easing, which had all kind of painful side effects, but actually kept economies alive. And indeed, they're still keeping them alive. the financial crisis was the economic equivalent of a heart attack, but we survived it, albeit with a bit of help. This is another heart attack, but of a different kind. So far, potentially the economic damage is much, much bigger. But if people do the right things, governments do the right things, then in a similar way, the costs can be mitigated.
And so it's an interesting one, because in terms of the banking crisis 10 years ago, a lot of central bank intervention, a lot of coordination between the G7, et cetera, et cetera. You're hearing less about the financial institutions and more about regular government this time. Is that a right interpretation, or is it, what is happening, do you think? The government seems to be taking much more of an obvious lead than it was 10 years ago.
Yes, and I think that's positive, actually, and not just in Britain. I mean, everywhere it's recognised that this is a problem the private sector can't cope with on its own. It wasn't anybody's fault. I mean, whereas the banking crisis was a result of failures and bad behaviour by the banks, amongst others, this is just an accident. It's come out of nowhere. Nobody needs to be punished or held to account for it. I mean, we're dealing with something extraneous, and governments recognise that they have a duty to save their countries in this situation, and that's positive. The big negative, compared with 10 years ago, is that then there was a very good cooperative attitude amongst governments. The European Union was working very well. The Gordon Brown in Britain was collaborating with other countries. The American administration was very cooperative. The Japanese similarly, and of course the Chinese kept the world economy going with a massive splurge of investment. And there was a sort of cooperative framework. Now we've lost all of that. Trump is partly to blame, picking fights, trying to destroy international institutions like the World Trade Organization, protectionism, but it's not just Trump. The Chinese have become much more nationalistic. We've had these populist movements in Europe, which have made European cooperation more difficult. We've had Brexit and so on. So the world is in a much less cooperative mood than it was 10 years ago, and that is dangerous.
Taking that to historical analogies, so you look at the cooperation 10 years ago, you look at the cooperation post-Second World War, of where the Bretton Woods, the whole way that America primed the global economy in the post-war period. You take that kind of positive approach, and you maybe compare what you've just described with more like the the late 20s and 30s, the beggar by thy neighbor policies, etc. Do you worry that we're going to be drifting down a path of petty political and economic nationalism, which actually means that we end up in a far worse situation than we would be?
Well, that is the danger, and there is a fair amount of evidence that that is the way governments have been behaving, and that's you see it every time President Trump opens his mouth, but not just him. I mean, there was this competitive scramble for ventilators and equipment that we needed to fight the pandemic. Governments behaving in a very nationalistic, self-centered way. One of the things that does worry me a bit is that, even if Trump were to lose and Biden were to win the election in November, it's interesting that the Republicans are already calling him Beijing Biden to try and polarize the issue, is that he will be strongly tempted politically to try to form an alliance against the Chinese. And if that happens, you break one of the really strong cooperative features of 10 years ago, where we worked very well with the Chinese economically.
So that's a global situation. In Britain, obviously, we're faced with our own version of what's going on. We've got a government that was elected by a near landslide just before Christmas. And they kind of made that landslide off the back of getting Brexit done. Do you think we should be slowing down that process at this point? Or, yeah, the mood music coming from the government is we will continue to carry on this process regardless. Is that foolhardy?
Well, I'm reluctant to start throwing around invective about Brexit again. I mean, we had 3 years of it for reasons which we don't need to go into again. The government won the argument because the anti-Brexit people were split in the general election. But yes, I mean, it would be sensible to postpone the issue. In practice, I think that will happen despite the rhetoric. We may end the transition, but I think there will be either a stated or unstated intention just to let the arrangements continue pretty much as they were before. If there were people in government determined to break up existing trading relationships and cooperation just for the sake of it, then that would do terrible damage. But I suspect that sense will prevail. I hope so.
So if you look at British society, obviously you're seeing huge challenges for low pay. You're seeing people who are on 0-hour contracts. You're seeing young people in particular being hit by this. Is the inevitable result of this, Vince? Do you think that society will be more divided at the end of this, or what should policymakers be doing to protect the young, those worst affected? How should be making sure that the pain or the benefit of a push into the economy is actually shared equally?
There are inequalities in Britain of different kinds, and to do with income, to do with wealth, to do with educational opportunities. I think the most jarring inequalities are becoming inequalities around age. We already saw this happening in the last 10 years, where people of my generation were protected. Our pensions have been proofed. So in fact, people's pensioners' income has not fallen in the last decade. It's actually risen, whereas working age people, particularly on low pay, have become poorer. Older people, of course, most of them, not everybody, have got the protection of rapidly increasing property values. And now we're in a position where older people, because they're classified as vulnerable, are in isolation, being protected from the disease unless they're in care homes and they've had a terrible time. But it's younger people who are suffering loss of jobs, massive insecurity, and all the burdens that will flow from that. I think another element of inequality we probably haven't thought about much in the past is what I would call spatial inequality. I mean, most of us, I'm very privileged in the lockdown to have been with my wife's home in the countryside. We're surrounded by beautiful country. There's a garden, and middle-class households in cities usually have gardens. But there are millions of people, younger people, overwhelmingly stuck in flats with no space, often no balconies, very limited leisure facilities, exercise facilities. And that kind of spatial inequality linked to differences in income and wealth and job opportunities, I think, are what will define this particular problem. You say, what do we do about it? I think the first priority is actually to get people back to work. And I'm afraid I'm one of those people who are in favor of taking more rather than less risks here. I know there is a danger that if the lockdown is ended too quickly, you then have this reinfection rate above 1, and we go back to where we were, if not worse, and we have to be careful. But I would be inclined to take risks to ensure that millions of people get back to their jobs as soon as possible, are able to earn more. That I think is now the priority.
And if people go back to work, obviously one of the other priming parts of the economy will be actually people starting to spend again. The longer this goes on, obviously people's incomes will fall, but also their desire, as you say, to go out to restaurants, go to the cinema, get those things that kind of start multiplying within the economy going. Is that your fear around the U or the L dip, that people kind of don't start, irrespective of earning, is they don't start spending again?
Yes, and it is, and it's several elements to that. I mean, one is simply the fear factor. Another is that if people are loaded with personal debt, I mean, they've had to borrow to get through this crisis, for example, they will be reluctant to go out and splash money. And that will in turn retard the recovery of the economy. And if we, going back to the international dimension, if we can't export because protectionist trade barriers are going up, there's yet another inhibition on demand. So the government has got to be ready to do more than it has done already to boost demand. And it can do that through universal payments, through more generous benefits, by cutting value-added tax, possibly for some time. I mean, we need to be thinking about demand stimulus. That's going to be the next big economic question, I think.
So that leads me on nicely to the question, things like HS2, the third runway at Heathrow. Now, obviously, you've got a huge change in the way that people are traveling in the short term. Now, is that part of a long-term trade? But would you be doing those kind of good old-fashioned Keynesian big projects that the government sponsor to get the economy going? Whether it's those in particular or things like that, would you do the Hoover Dam is the example in America, the Tennessee Valley Association, those things?
Well, there are probably less physically infrastructure type things. I mean, building houses is a simpler way of getting the construction industry going than these mega projects. But yes, we will need a stimulus, and that is one way of doing it. I mean, on the other hand, is not going to recover in a hurry. People are not going to travel to the same extent. Tourism, why have travel to the other part of the world for a business meeting when you can do Zoom? Travel will be much less, and incoming travel will be stopped because people are coming from infected areas. So the aviation expansion will be on hold. Similarly, there will be a reluctance to use public transport, very sadly, because it's environmentally better, but public transport is going to take a massive hit. And so, rail projects are potentially in some trouble. So the two examples you gave are not good ones, but in general, public investment projects are to be welcomed.
So what would you, if you were back in the Secretary of State, what would you be doing? What would be the things that you'd be pressing the button on going forward, assuming you got your Treasury colleagues to agree? Well,
the first thing is to get the lockdown right, and we partly covered that already. I say I'm relatively impatient, but I recognise the disease problem, and we've got to be very, very careful. So that's the first thing, getting out lockdown as smoothly and quickly as is feasible. I think secondly, making absolutely sure that there is enough spending power in the economy to ensure that when factories and shops reopen, they're not driven further down by a collapse in demand. And demand is something that the governments can manage directly through the budget or indirectly through the monetary policy of the Bank of England. And then I think thirdly, there is going to have to be massive involvement in getting people back into work, because a lot of the old jobs are going to be gone for good. So an enormous amount of retraining, helping people back into emergency projects of one kind or another. A big role, I think, for bodies like the City Lit, actually, for continuing learning and continuing training and education. I mean, these things will be massively important.
A couple of questions around property have come up, both in terms of the amount to help organisations, as you say, retail organisations, but the small businesses who haven't been able to use their property, but they've still got to pay rents. There's a sort of issue around commercial rents and commercial property and what could be done to alleviate pressure on businesses around that. And then there's a couple of questions, interesting, Vince, about people who are obviously, I think I saw a stat to say that were 400,000 house purchases on hold at the moment. And a couple of people have asked, would you essentially be buying property at the moment, or would you be standing back from the market? So there's a commercial question, and then there's a more sort of individual, what would people be doing at this point in the market? Obviously, you're not a financial advisor, Vince, so therefore we would...
No, I don't have a great personal record in property at all. But no, my instincts are that both commercial property and residential property will be quite depressed for some time. I mean, in the case of commercial property, if you're a retailer, you're struggling both with rates, which at the moment you can't afford to pay, and with upward-only rent reviews. You're locked into a legal arrangement with a rent that is almost certainly unrealistic in current context. So there's going to be a big battle between tenants and landlords in the high street sector. And government, I think, can help at least by reforming the business rate system, which is very old-fashioned and very onerous on bricks and mortar businesses. On the personal side, yes, the housing market is currently depressed because there are no transactions taking place. The factor that has sustained house prices in the past is the artificial injection of money into the economy through quantitative easing, and a lot of that credit has been poured into the housing market in a very dangerous way. And one of the major sources of inequality, of course, is between people of an older generation who are sitting on property but without mortgage, and people who can't afford to get into the housing market. And I would hope that the government, working with the Bank of England, now takes advantage of this opportunity to stabilize the housing market, get the relationship between house prices and incomes at a much lower level. And that is partly a question of improving supply, and we're talking there about councils as well as private developers getting back into the house building business, but also dampening down house prices so that they don't get out of control. So I would actually be fairly bearish about property values, but that's just a personal instinct. I mean, we can't predict these things.
So we've spent quite a lot of time talking your views as an economist, and you've strayed a little bit into the area of politics. A great question, which is, do you wish you were Prime Minister at this point so you could roll your sleeves and get it sorted out, or are you actually quite glad you're out of it at the moment?
I respond positively to the challenge of crisis. I mean, one of the reasons I went into government in 2010 was not because I particularly liked the people I was in government with. I mean, I've been fighting them all my life. I actually got on well with most of them in practice. But it was the fact that there was a major crisis and a major challenge, and I wanted to get involved and see what we could do to help. And although lots of the things I and others have done have been criticised, I think on balance there was certainly mine and some of my colleagues a good legacy of real achievement. So to answer your question, I mean, I regret not being there and would love to be there, but I mean, I'm now retired, so that's an academic question.
So if you were going to advise your former colleagues and some of the new boys and girls who are in government, what would the Vince silver bullet be at this point? What would the thing that they would have to do at this point?
No, there isn't a silver bullet. I mean, that is, I think we need to stress that from the outset, that first of all, this is very, very complex. It's very, very uncertain. Nobody knows how this disease is going to develop, how quickly vaccines will be available, and we can see the back of it. No, it's a very, very difficult set of problems, and that's in a way the challenge. There is no silver bullet.
Which I think actually is probably a perfect point to end at that point. Well, not a perfect point, but a very opposite point in terms of the challenges facing. Vince, I thought, and I've had a number of comments come through of just the way that you took us through the presentation and then the questions of just making a very complicated situation much clearer and looking at the different scenarios that might happen. At some point later down the line, I would almost certainly like to invite you back to see how this is developing and what's gone right and what's gone wrong. And as you always have been when you were Secretary of State, but ever since, you've been a great friend of City Lit. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing this. I would like to very much thank Charmaine, who's now going to get embarrassed because you thank her and she's having to translate that. And I would like to thank the City Lit community, literally the hundreds of you that have logged on for this, but also those of you who are taking part in all of the courses we're doing. Over 1,000 of our courses have been moved online during the course of the last 6 weeks. Given that we were purely a face-to-face college a mere 6 weeks ago, it's been a huge testament to the enormous amount of work my colleagues have done. Not everything can go online, obviously, given our huge emphasis on the visual and performing arts, but lots of our language and our humanities, our work with our deaf students, all of that's been moved online, and I'd be delighted if you continue to engage with us in this period. Obviously, it's a different challenge, but when normal service is resumed, we'll be back in the college. But in the meantime, we'll be maintaining contact with all of our community and supporting them in the best we can. So Vince, again, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a brilliant hour. Hugely appreciate the time and the effort that you've done. And thank you to everybody who's been part of this. I hope everybody stays well and safe. Thank you.
Thank you.